There are a lot of stakeholders, and institutional and otherwise, who have a very important role to play. Part two of today's discussion, starting now, we'll start looking at some of those extra agencies that need to be involved, and we'll start with standardization and regulation. Both Cengiz and some of the speakers mentioned the fact that the programs now, the new projects, have to provide a document on standardization recommendations and regulatory recommendation. This is mandatory because we cannot move forward now unless we do the work against a background of effective regulation and effective standardization. The agencies that will be responsible for taking these recommendations and doing something with it are many and various, but I'd like to introduce three of the agencies today. And one, of course, is the European Commission. I'd like to invite Niklas Ertmans to join me on stage. And the second one is, of course, EASA. And I'd like to invite Stefan Vollburg to join me up here as well. Stefan, good afternoon. And I must now make an apology. The third agency that was going to join us was EUROCAE. Now, EUROCAE, as you know, is a European standardization body and very heavily involved with U-Space. And Alain Vallet was going to represent EUROCAE today, but unfortunately he's been taken sick. So my best wishes to Alain for a very speedy recovery. I spoke to Anna von Krote, the ED of EUROCAE, and since I am actually a member of the EUROCAE TAC, I will present Alain's slides unadulterated from him, and if I make any mistakes, it's my fault, not Alain's. But I'll do the best I can to represent the EUROCAE position. This second part is going to be done in a slightly different format. It's not more presentations only. We are going to have a panel discussion afterwards. So each of our presenters will start with a small presentation, and then at the end we'll have a short discussion before concluding. So with no further ado, I'd like to ask Nicolas if you'd like to come to the front to give your presentation. Nicolas is a policy officer in DG Move's Aviation Safety Unit. He worked on the UAS and U-Space regulatory frameworks, as well as the just-released drone strategy too. Nicolas holds a master in telecoms engineering and focuses on technical and standardization experts. Over to you, Nicolas.
Thank you, Robin, and good afternoon, everybody. So, yes, trying to cover in 2 slides or 3 slides the regulatory and standardization framework for drones, quite a challenge. So, just as a kind of recap, it's been mentioned several times yesterday and today, for drones we have a risk-based, operation-centric UAS framework, and this has some implications in terms of regulation and standardization. On the far right, you have the certified category of operations. Basically, for high-risk operations, we apply the existing aviation safety framework, certified aircraft, licensed remote pilot, certified operators. So a very similar approach to manned aircraft operations, commercial manned aircraft operations, even though the regulatory framework will maybe need some amendments here and there. On the other extreme, on the left, we have the open category, and there it was considered that the essential requirements of the aviation safety framework could be met without applying the traditional approach, without requiring the certification of aircraft. And we do have there the buy and fly category of operations, where you buy your drone and you operate them as long as you comply with strict operational requirements and your drone complies with technical requirements, which are in what we call community harmonization legislation. And there we are actually applying the product harmonization framework. It's not the aviation safety framework. And this means also that the standards and the means of compliance that we will develop for the open category are not the traditional EUROCAE standards or ASD STAN, but they will have to be published by CEN, CENELEC or ETSI as harmonized standards to provide presumption of compliance. So fairly different standardization framework. in the middle, we have the specific category. You heard already about that. There we have a mix of maybe higher risk operations that may require the certification of the drones. Therefore, we are closer to the certified category. Or we could operate on the declaration with standard scenarios. And there again, we could use CE-marked drones, which are then following the product harmonization legislation. This is translated into a number of regulations. So the basic regulation is basically the regulation that, when it was amended 4 years ago, introduced that risk-based operation-centric approach and extended the scope of EU regulations to all drones. And it's been supported by more detailed regulations. So in the middle there, you have the drones regulatory framework 945, 947. 947 is basically defining the different types of drone operations. And 945 is the product harmonization legislation defining the requirements for the small drones. But you also have the use-based regulation. And then you have a whole range of existing aviation regulations, from aircrew regulations to ATM, ANS, common requirements. And all those are being scrutinized, are being reviewed to basically enable the certified category of operations. And there we are talking about different types of operations, from parcel delivery with maybe larger drones and risky cargo, to larger IFR cargo, to urban air mobility, innovative air mobility operations. And this will require amendment in different phases, in different steps of all those regulations for the best part of the coming decade. So a lot of work planned, ongoing, and more required in the coming years to address in order of priority IAM and cargo operations in the future. And maybe to conclude my quick introduction, a few challenges, opportunities and challenges that are associated with the drone regulatory framework and the standardization activities. We are dealing with new aviation actors, not traditional aviation professionals, which means that we need to develop work on our communication guidelines. And EASA is doing a terrific job on that, and developing also the IAM hub, as we heard yesterday. But we need to do more there, to convey a clear message to all stakeholders. Risk-based and operation-centric framework means that we have something adapted to every single type of operations, but it's also a complex framework. So again, we need to provide more guidelines. We need to revisit the framework to see where we can streamline it and make sure it remains proportionate. We have the European standardization framework versus the traditional aviation standardization framework. We may maybe have the opportunity to discuss that later today. Pace of technological innovation. Yes, aviation is a sector which evolves traditionally very slowly. The drone sector is totally different, so maybe we need to go for a novel approach sometimes and maybe to adopt ICT standards where it's appropriate and not necessarily aviation-specific standards. And we have other challenges like cybersecurity, integration of ATM and U-Space, been mentioned several times today already. Integration of manned and unmanned, also quite important, also from purely a legal point of view, because, we will be confronted with also what is in ICAO and what is outside of the ICAO scope, but as U-Space, ATM, manned and unmanned starts to merge and converge, we will have to address that. And then automation and autonomy, one of the big challenges also for the coming years to properly address in regulation and standardization. So that's in a nutshell, a few slides, my introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicolas. If we look at the standardization work in Europe, you'll see in the middle there we have this pyramid. And the pyramid describes the way that standardization is used in Europe. It can be used at the top there as a direct mechanism for supporting regulation. But it also is there to help the definition of implementing rules, or as soft law, which is a way of industry to start to earn the connectivity and their interoperability, even though it's not regulated to do so. What is important, though, is it's not just done by an organization such as EUROCAE. EUROCAE is its members. And it has the members who do this work and produce through the existence of working groups, each of which has been specified to do a particular task. It works in coordination with many international bodies, as you can see on the left, and it leads to deployment. The aim of the standardization is to enable industry and users to deploy. This is done two ways. There's the bottom-up. Now, the bottom-up is pressure from industry, where industry people have got together, they have a requirement, a need, and they can all invent something different and try and make it work, or they can get together in a group and create a standard that allows them to compete, but also produce products that can be plugged into the system in an interoperable way. But also, there is the top-down. And the top-down is when there is a regulatory need. There's a regulatory need for something to happen, and so the standardization organization, EUROCAE, looks at this need and says, you know what, we're going to need a working group to address this and provide the standards needed to implement this particular regulation. Within the concept of the domain of use space and unmanned flight, there is a working group 105, Unmanned Aerial Systems, UAS. It's actually one of the biggest working groups in EUROCAE, and it has the scope to develop standards for the integration of all types of UAS into all classes of airspace. So that covers the larger IFR RPAS as well as U-Space, and of course our main interest today is U-Space, but nevertheless there is a lot of standardization work going on for all types of UAS. This complements the UAS regulatory framework with performance-based standards, trying not to get into any particular technology here. We need to try to standardize how well a technology functions and how it should function to allow the market to evolve. It has to link with R&D, and these are these STAN and reg documents that we mentioned earlier on, where you get the R&D recommendations that are fed into the standardization activity, which then enable details of performance to be worked out from experience in validation exercises. And indeed, you very often find that the members of the working groups are actually the same people who are involved with the SESAR projects directly. And of course, coordination with other stakeholders is critical. So bring as many people in for the membership, but also disseminate and share this information to try and get as much wisdom on a particular topic in before going to publish a standard, which may stand for many years. Now, the current activities within Working Group 105 include detect and avoid. We haven't heard much about detect and avoid yet today, which is a few years ago. That's all you'd hear about. But nevertheless, it's a very important aspect of what's going on, and where it fits into the jigsaw is still being worked on. And in fact, in many cases, some of the standards already exist. Enhanced RPAS automation. We've heard a lot about automation, and it's a very simple word, but it's extremely complicated. To try and automate things to the level that we're talking about is going to take a lot of work and a lot of standardization activity before we can be sure that automated systems can operate safely alongside manned systems. UTM, U-Space, stands to reason, and our projects will obviously make a large contribution to the EUROCAE activities there. But C3, spectrum and security, very important in this increasingly digitized world, where we have connectivity at the core of pretty much all we do. The command, control, and communications elements, C3, as well as spectrum allocation, and then the security of that data link, are all issues of enormous security and are covered by standardization activities. Design and airworthiness are at the very core of enabling air vehicles to fly, and standards support that. And then, of course, there's SORA, the specific operational risk assessment methodology, which underpins operations in the specific category. The activities on U-Space underway at the moment in EUROCAE. We have the network identification service of UAV for UTM and for U-Space. Technical specifications for geographical zones. This is in support of the regulation framework. And then we have the GeoMS awareness service also in support of regulation. Flight planning and authorization service for global awareness, which is we've seen how important it is to register and to have the authorization for a particular flight, and this is being standardized. And of course, traffic information situation dissemination is critical to sharing information amongst all the stakeholders. All this is underway at the moment within the SESAR the EUROCAE working groups. But this can't be done in isolation. We actually are in a bigger world, and if we're trying to increase interoperability, not just within Europe, but to allow a global market, for example, so your products can operate anywhere, then we need to work side by side with additional standardization organizations. And EUROCAE has formal arrangements with a number. There's some examples here. Of note, you can see there that the RTCA, 50% of the working groups are joint working groups, which means at the end there is a standard that will have two numbers, an RTCA number and a EUROCAE number. This is really very important because we're trying to make as much as possible globally harmonized. Obviously, working with ICAO is very important to this, and the SAE, another large American-based standardization organization, we have joint working groups with them. Thank you very much, and I'd now like to introduce Stefan Vollborg. Stefan is in the EASA drone team as a drone specialist manager in charge of U-Space. His technical career has been as a software engineer specializing in aviation embedded systems with major system suppliers. He spent 10 years in EASA Certification Directorate as expert in software, avionics and cybersecurity before commencing his current role. Stefan.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you, Nicola. Actually, your presentation will help me to introduce what we want to have for U-Space. So I will not repeat on the whole spectrum of standards and regulatory framework that we have. We try to focus a bit more on what we need for U-Space and the implementation of U-Space. Just a quick reminder of the three building blocks that we have for U-Space. So we have three sets of regulation. The C64, which is meant to address really what is U-Space, 665, the impact on the ATM ENS, and 666 about the rule of the air, SESAR. We need standards to ensure a proper implementation of the whole systems. So we see and we are perceiving the standards like technical enablers. No standard, no possibility to tell what are the different things to be implemented by the stakeholders, for instance, the USSPs. Today, we have already a series of set of standards dealing with geo-awareness, traffic information, network information AD, or interoperability of USSP. We are totally agnostic, in terms of who provide the standards. We are working with EUROCAE, we are working with STM, we may work with other entities, provided that the standard is of good quality, answer to our needs, technical needs, and is used by the industry. So the standard that you have today here in the display, coming from EUROCAE or STM, are used by the industry. We are not enforcing any particular standard, but what we want to achieve is a kind of consensus about the use. And we try to achieve that through the various discussions that we have with the various stakeholders. One particularity of this presentation is about e-conspicuity. EASA has developed, because there was no working group dealing with that topic in the industry, try to address what we need to achieve regarding e-conspicuity. So how to make a manned aircraft visible to the USSPs when they are transiting in U-Space airspace. We have developed our own specification based on ADSB, what we are calling ADSB Lite, and a specification will be published soon with regard to this, what we call ADSL for SRD 860. So it means kind of, try to say that, I don't want to advertise more than we do, but kind of FLAM-based solution or similar solutions. So you will see soon this specification published along the MCGM that will publish for the 664, 665, and 666. So that's where we did not rely on standard bodies for standardization, but we develop our own standard with necessarily the support of the industry. What we miss today. So you saw there are some already standards available, and we are calling them in the MCGM. However, we still have some blocks which are missing, especially starting for the things that we need to support the services. Weather information. We don't have data quality requirement. We don't have a list of data to be broadcasted. We don't have accuracy, etc., integrity. So if a USSP comes to us today and want to be certified with the weather information service, we'll be quite in difficulty to define what are the performance requirements of the services and what they need to demonstrate. And similarly for the member state. We are still lacking standards to standardize the information that the USSP need to be exchanged. And for instance, to ensure the unicity of traffic information. We want to have one aircraft displayed and not multiple or this kind of thing. We are lacking industry consensus. When I mentioned the ASTM standard or EuroCase standard, we are facing different perceptions or positions. So we try to anyway call for some of them because they are technical enablers again. But we see that there is still no consensus in industry with regard to the use of the standards. And we would like to go forward, make sure that there is a common and accepted solutions over Europe. To enable that, we're also missing alternatives. So it's easy to say, yeah, the standard is not good enough, or et cetera, but we need to compare standard against standard, not perception against perception. We need to have alternatives to be able to select the best one for the best use in the use space. And today, we are missing alternatives to some of the standards. To try to compensate that lack of alternatives, following up the project funded by the European Commission, which was called airworthiness drones, we have a follow-up managed by ESA, which is the Shepherd project, which goes beyond the use space, strictly speaking, but are looking for all the standards that could be used to support the drones activity, including use space. So we hope that this standard will try to promote some alternatives to the standard that we have today. We are also calling for the industry to be more active, more proactive in the various working groups like SDSTAN, like EuroCase, to deliver. We need the industry to deliver the standards in order to help us to recognize more alternatives, more technical possibilities, etc., to support the implementation of use space. Otherwise, we are stuck. A bit more critical, we are facing two issues in the first implementations that we are seeing over Europe. The biggest program is interoperability. It has been mentioned, for instance, for the You Welcome project. And I welcome this initiative because the biggest program that we see today is how to ensure interoperability between the various systems which are being developed in several countries over Europe. I tried to remind something. Per the regulation, there was a clear requirement that, for instance, for the communication between the SIS and the USSPs, we need to ensure a common, open, and interoperable protocol. So it means that we need to find an agreement over Europe to ensure that one USSP, which is certified in a country, will have the capability to move to another one and to adapt the systems in a kind of easy manner, kind of plug and play, ultimately, and to provide services in other parts of Europe. And today, we don't have that capacity. It has been several times reminded by EASA as a critical point, critical path for implementation, starting in 2018. And we urge really the industry and the member states to sit together and to provide that answer to that problematic. We have a task force currently ongoing with the member state and EASA, and we ask the representatives of the member state to go back to their industry and try to get what could be done to achieve this interoperability aspects. Last but not least, we need to have a complete and harmonized performance requirement. The idea of use space is to be performance-based. The problematic of this approach is certainly adaptative and flexible, which is very good, but that we may lead to totally fragmented solutions and inconsistent set of performance requirements over Europe. So it needs to be adaptative, it needs to be performance-based, but for the sake of the implementation, we need to have some kind of harmonization over Europe. What we will need in the future to support, for instance, the drone strategy and the evolution of use space, and certainly higher integration between manned and unmanned aircraft, we need to support new technologies like detect and avoid capabilities, new set of services, and to support definitely emergent technologies. Artificial intelligence has been mentioned this morning. EASA is working on that, but we need the support of the industry to accompany this motion. Something we would like to also to achieve in order to streamline the implementation and ensure consistency over Europe is a kind of predefined set of scenarios and use cases. So we have a use space airspace design in a controlled airspace close to an urban area. What could be predefined set of performance requirements? Similarly, if we are in a remote area far to an urban area, what could be the variation in terms of performance requirements? So this kind of predetermined set will certainly help the member state and the competent authorities to do the designation of the use space airspace, help the industry also to have kind of idea to what would be the level of performance requirement to be satisfied in order to be certified and allowed to operate. So definitely that will streamline the use space implementation over Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. And we have a few minutes left. We'd like to have a short discussion with you. So may I first ask a question to you, Nicolas? What lessons have we learned from the regulatory process so far? And how will these be applied as we move forward? What went well? What didn't go quite so well?
Interesting question. So, well, we haven't learned much from the applicability of all the application of the use space framework yet, because it's only going to be applicable as from next year. But generally speaking, I think first, before looking into the problems and what we can improve upon, I think we should highlight the big benefit of having a single European drone framework that supports free movement of operators, services across the union, and that's really a big plus. We got really a very positive feedback from the industry, and even though it's a work in progress in terms of fully harmonizing the application of the framework across the union, enabling operators to get a license or an operation authorization in a country and replicating that kind of operations across the union without the need to go through the complete authorization process. That's a big plus. And having rules for drones for the open category valid for the union, that's also a big plus. And for what use space concerns, we see also that there are a number of use space service providers that are interested to get certified locally or by EASA directly to provide services across the union again. So that's really a very big, I would say, a positive point about the regulatory framework. Now, the regulatory framework is indeed a bit complex, and that's why we need to further work on the guidelines, the guidance. We've already, EASA has already issued two versions of the guidance material for the drone regulatory framework itself. About to deliver the guidance material for use space, which is a result of quite a significant work with a number of stakeholders over almost 2 years now. The IAM Hub is also a good example of something that EASA is embarking upon to provide additional guidance to stakeholders in the implementation of the regulatory framework and use space and IAM. So need for more guidance.
Thank you, Nicolas. So that's interesting, Stefan. We've heard now that with industry feedback has been very good on the regulatory process, and of course the regulation started with essentially work from EASA. That work continues. So are you in dialogue with the Commission about what the next stage is? Is it too early for that yet? Or are you already looking at what the next steps are to expand the regulation?
So the question is, the answer is dual. For the moment, we are rushing and working hard on the release of the MCGM to the 664, 665, and 666. So definitely, that's the goal, and that's burning, and the industry is waiting. However, we are not forgetting the evolutions and the future of what could be use space. So, indeed, we are planning to have some discussion first to get the information and feedback all along the implementation in 2023. That will lead to two things. First, quick revision of the MC and GM with the support of the Commission on some aspects because we have some clarifications to get, and ultimately change to the regulation. So we know that the regulation has been raised in advance in order to vitalize, really to push the development of use space, and for good reasons and for good result. We know that we'll have to adjust the regulation at some point with the support of the Commission. So it will be a long-term process, not long-term, sorry, mid-term, 1-2 years, not that far in the future, but that's something we need to engage already in 2023 to get feedback and to propose some modifications to the Commission. Yeah.
Very good, thank you. Staying with you, Stefan, then. We saw in your presentation that that there are outstanding things in the standardization contribution to the regulation. I wonder, could you somehow explain to us a little bit how standards are used within a regulatory environment and why they're important? Because if you've got regulation, the standard is just another document, isn't it? How is this contributing?
Actually, they are absolutely essential pillars to certification. It's why we are struggling to welcome some applications for certification because we are missing some performance requirements. I try to explain in a few words how it works, or it should work. The certification will be granted based on the demonstration of satisfaction some performance requirements. The performance requirements are not solely given in the MCGM, but on the standards themselves. So the applicant, so USSPs or single CISP, will have to take the standard and show that they are meeting what is inside the standard in terms of data format, latencies, etc., etc. There is also an initiative which will be extremely interesting to evaluate through FOCA at various bytes, which is automated verification. In order to ease the recertification or initial certification, they will develop a set of tests based on the standards. So we need to have that, those standards available to demonstrate that through automated testing, that the applicant, the USSP, satisfy the performance requirement in automated manner, so less human interactions, easier process, much more efficient process in time. And again, for the recertification, that will be the same. So the standards are absolutely essentials in the certification scheme.
Very good, thank you very much indeed. Nicola, oh yes, please.
If I can just add one thing to what Stefan just said is, the use-based regulation in particular is really a performance-based regulation with fairly high-level objectives. And in a performance-based framework, you really need standards to achieve interoperability, and that's really key in use-based. And as we've seen in the past, you should not underestimate the time it takes to develop standards. We've already had to delay the applicability of some rules in the past, drones and non-drones, for the late availability of standards. And so this is really something which needs to be taken, kept in mind, the importance of the standards and be ready with those.
That's understood. So sticking with that theme, standards within Europe is easy to contemplate, or as easy as it can be to contemplate, but we need the international cooperation as well. We need to promote as much as possible the ability of European industry to compete outside Europe as well, or for greater interoperability globally, which is always a laudable aim in itself. How much activity is there, maybe this is a question for both of you actually, how much activity is there to coordinate the regulatory and standardization activities between Europe and the rest of the world?
Well, the Commission set up coordination groups for standardization in Europe, starting with ATM Standardization Coordination Group, probably almost 10 years ago. And on that model, they have set up a European UAS Standardization Coordination Group 4-5 years ago, maybe. And that group is not only gathering the expertise of European standardization organizations, but international standardization organizations, whether it's ISO, ASTM, that's been mentioned earlier today. And those standardization organizations, they coordinate their activities in that group. The EASA is actually now chairing that coordination group, and in that group we can assess the need for standards, the gaps, the overlaps, and basically, this is the basis for coordination and collaboration between organizations, standardization organizations, on standards that are required to support implementation of the UAS regulation. And I think we've been fairly successful in Europe in establishing those coordination between EU and non-EU standardization organizations. And as Stefan mentioned, there's a few ASTM standards that are actually being used in the European framework as means of compliance, and which provide, indeed, the European industry also a competitive advantage if they want to put products on the market in the US, for instance, where they would be interoperable with the systems that are there.
No, actually, we are less involved than some other stakeholders in regulation because we let the industry to come with their solutions. For sure, we are evaluating what is proposed, make sure that the quality is the one we need. And, but we are definitely relying on the various industry bodies and standardization bodies to come to us with a solution. So we are following, but we try to not be prescriptive in our approach and let the industry to come to us with a consensus or consensuses, potentially plural. But we follow, we look, we are expecting a lot, we are expecting deliverables. We are not that involved, except for the specific things for conspicuity, where we have taken the lead with the support industry. But otherwise, we are waiting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both. I think what I'm hearing is actually a very positive picture, in that now we have a regulatory framework about to come into force, supported by an active standardization community, which has the broad support of industry and the participation of industry. For me, that bodes very well for the future of the European use space, and I think the contribution by both the European Commission and by ESA, and in absentio by EUROCAE and other standardization organizations, has been material in reaching this. So thank you very much for your contribution this afternoon. It's been a real pleasure to hear from you. Nicola and Stefan, please.